Hi, I'm Geraldine Gallagher and I'm the CEO of the Executive Coaching Consultancy. And welcome to our podcast, Shifting the Needle. Those of you that know me from Shifting the Needle will know that I'm really interested in changing the system. And so for that reason, I'm really delighted to have our guest today. Our guest today is Neil Basu. Neil spent 30 years in the Metropolitan Police. And at one point, he was actually the most senior police officer of colour in the UK. And so therefore, you can imagine, Neil and I have got quite a lot to talk about with regards to changing the system. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit more about the jobs that Neil has done, because I think I need to consult my notes, because one of the things I noticed when I was reading Neil's book was that the titles are extremely long. So Neil was the former Assistant Commissioner Specialist Operations for the Metropolitan Police Service, National Lead for Counter-Terrorism Policing from 2018 to 2021, and also the Strategic Command Course Director for 2021, which is policing's most senior leadership programme for future Chief Constables. So we have both the system and leadership in common. He's now an author, a public speaker, and hosts a podcast called The Crime Agents, which I have listened to, and it's excellent. And today, much of the conversation is based on my having read the book and having had a chat with Neil before. And I'd just like to point out the book, Turmoil, 30 Years of Policing, Politics and Prejudice. It's a really good read and I would certainly recommend it. So let me introduce and welcome Neil.
Thank you, Geraldine. Delighted to be here, and thank you very much for promoting the book and the podcast. I'm very grateful.
They're great. I really enjoyed them. Neil, what does it feel like to be on the other side of the desk here, me interrogating you?
I've had to do an awful lot of that in my career. I started doing media in policing 25 years ago as a DCI who ran a murder squad, and it takes about 25 years to get used to it, but you do eventually get used to being interviewed. So.
Okay. So I promise not to interrogate you. I'll interview. My first question is, what inspired the book?
Well, it's interesting because I didn't, if people read the book, they'll understand that I didn't retire entirely voluntarily. Politics had a great deal to do with the end of my career. So nobody should ever sit down and write their memoir in a fit of pique or, because they're bitter or angry. But there were two things, there was a lot that was left unsaid because I retired when I did. There were a lot of things I wanted to say but weren't going to get the opportunity to do. And anyone who leaves a job at that level, you're kind of used to people listening to you and being able to make change and to do important things. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you're staring at the walls and you don't know what to do. And I didn't know what to do. And my office rang me up and said, there's a load of post here, usual bag of hate mail. I was a police officer, I was in counter-terrorism, but there's one here you might be interested in. And I got my old PA, to read it out to me. She said, I'll send it to you, you can read it, it's obviously personal. I said, no, don't do that, just open it and read it to me. I trusted her, she was an absolutely wonderful person, ran my life for a very long time. Just read it out to me. And she basically said, well, it's from a woman called Amberly Lois. She's a literary agent, she's starting a new firm, and basically she watched your last interview with Cathy Newman on Channel 4 and she thinks you can write a book. Now, Cathy Newman had told me to go away and write a book and introduce me to her publisher and her agent. They weren't that interested in a policing memoir. So I thought I'd go and have a cup of coffee with Amberly, went to see her, and of course she asked me what I would want to write about, and it was largely around institutional racism. My career was bookended by a boy called Stephen Lawrence. Stephen was murdered in Eltham in 1993. It was a racist murder by 6 racist thugs. It was an absolutely terrible event. I was busy shining my shoes at Hendon the night he was murdered, and I passed out from Hendon the following day. 4 years later, I'm called up to the Lawrence Inquiry team with the Met, about to get a kicking on why they had so disgracefully cocked up that murder investigation. So I was on that team looking at that. Years later, I was the detective superintendent on the 4th reinvestigation of Stephen's murder, having met Doreen and promised her we would do the best we could. And Doreen looked at us saying, she said barely anything in that hour-long meeting. She wasn't interested in us anymore. I didn't blame her at all. The way we treated the family was appalling. And then by the time I retired, 6 months after I retired, I got an invitation to the memorial service in St Martin's in the Field, which is where the book starts. which was Stephen's, the memorial of his murder in 2023, 40 years later. And I'm sort of sitting in this, 30 years later, sorry, and I'm sitting in the church listening to Keir Starmer, the Mayor of London. Keir was the opposition leader at the time, saying how they're going to hold the Metropolitan Police to account for institutional racism. Now, we had a brand new commissioner, my friend Mark Rowley, my old boss, and he wouldn't admit institutional racism because, of course, the politics of the day, the same politics that had driven me out of the job. Suella Braverman was Home Secretary at the time, and he would never have been given the job had he admitted policing was still institutionally racist. And he used other expressions. He used systemic, which was an interchangeable word for institutional. He called it political and ambiguous as a statement and unhelpful. And he didn't realise this because he was taking his break from policing before he applied. But in December 2021, I had been at National Police Chiefs Council arguing with Chiefs Council that they should admit it, apologise for it, and then launch the race action plan they had all signed up to after the murder of George Floyd. And one of my fellow chief constables argued against that and said, we're not institutionally anything. They had a blind vote because we're all so brave we can't say what we think in public. So we all had to write into the chair of Chiefs Council, Martin Hewitt, and tell him whether we agreed or disagreed with Neil or the opposite speaker. And I lost that vote. And that was the day I decided to retire from policing. So that was part of the reason. Part of the reason was the Conservative administration at the time were never going to give me a top job again. So I was inevitably going to have to retire on time anyway. And largely they wouldn't give me a job because I was seen as this super woke individual. And given that I was, as you pointed out, I was the most senior officer of colour in the country, but I was only the fourth person to reach my rank since 1829 in policing. And to be treated like that because somehow you're standing up for issues of diversity, equality and inclusion at a time post-George Floyd where we all thought that was going to be another watershed moment like Stephen Lawrence, and realised that speaking out hadn't done me any. In fact, not only had it not changed the world it changed my life quite dramatically because I was very clearly marked from that moment on, and that was going to be the end of my career.
Yeah, that really fascinated me in the book because you talk about FIFO, which is, I keep wanting to say first in, but it's not, of course, it's fit in or F off.
Yes.
Yeah. And basically, a lot of the book, the phrase that you repeat for quite a bit is shame on me when you think back, because you were good at fitting in.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting. Just to go back to the reasons for writing the book, because I really want, particularly any police officer that would hear this, I was always really nervous that they would think I somehow didn't like my profession. I loved it. Yeah, it wasn't a job, it was a vocation. This is a love letter to policing. I love thousands and thousands of police officers I worked with, just not all of them. But it's also about telling you just how tough that job is. Everyone thinks they know what it's like now with the number of documentaries and TV shows and real life stuff now. It sort of shows what policing can do to you, whether you're a police constable or an assistant commissioner. And the last thing is what it can do to your families. So it was really an apology and at least an explanation to my children about where I was and why their mother and I weren't still together and what policing can do to you as a family. That backfired spectacularly. The reality being, well, one of my children made it very clear to me when I said, have you read the book? And he said, I read it immediately from cover to cover when you gave it to me. And he said, the last line killed me. And I said, what do you mean the last line killed you? And he said, well, you wrote it. And I said, I know what the last line says, Jamie, but the sentiment of the last line was something he found very difficult to live with, and I found very difficult to live with. And I would say he was right. So, and the point about this is that police officers, you're paid to put somebody else's family or strangers before your own. And that's always going to be the way with a 24/7 emergency response. But you make that choice, and it's a selfish choice. And whether you think you've done a good thing and you want your family to be proud of you because of what you've done and where you've reached, the sacrifice that comes with that is sometimes very hard to bear. So that was one of the reasons for the book, and that was part of the turmoil of the title. But the other part was nobody ever asked me how I got to the top of the profession. It's an odd thing. Whenever I speak publicly, the speech I give on diversity and leadership is essentially the speech that led to this book. It's like, half a chapter of the book. But nowhere in the Q&A afterwards does anyone say, well, how did you make it? And of course, there are lots of reasons for that. Largely, I don't really consider myself a great diversity role model in some respects. I was born into a middle-class family with successful, well-educated parents. I had really successful siblings and friends who were all well-educated, went to a good state school, so educated at state expense, but at a good school, got good qualifications. I'd had pretty much every advantage you can think of. Eventually went to university, got a degree. I played a lot of team sport, so I understood that, playing as a team and collaborating and cooperating was going to get you better results. And I enjoyed all of that, so I understood that. But the thing that really made the difference is I figured out from a very early age, I sort of found out I was different at 5. I was first racially abused at 7. I was beaten up at 11. And I understood very quickly what fit in or F off meant. Yeah. If you couldn't, as a lot of my friends said to me at that time, play the white man, you were in trouble. You were born a man into a man's world, that's great, but you were born the wrong colour. And if you don't fit in, you're going to be in trouble. So,
because just for clarity, you have a Welsh mum.
I have a white Welsh mum and a Bengali Indian dad from Calcutta who I lost 10 years ago, still the worst day of my life. Still think about him every day. But yeah, so I'm mixed race, very obviously Indian, or I think I'm obviously Indian. I had a colleague who's, when I retired, said, and he was actually at one of these speeches and he heard me speak and he said, but I didn't even realise you were mixed race for 20 years. And he didn't realise, he's a friend, he was trying to be nice, but he didn't realise that in itself was quite a racist thing to say. Because you just don't...
It's almost like, oh, you're all right.
Yes,
you didn't realise
or you'd never bother to ask, or why.
Yeah, exactly,
but partly that's down to me. And the turmoil is you don't stand up and speak on a soapbox about diversity and equality because you don't want to get shot down. Absolutely. You want to make absolutely certain that you're safe and you're okay. And I was raised by an expression which I still see young people, people in the audience, everyone who's my age, and I'm 58, so everyone who's my age understands exactly. We all born in the 60s, grew up in the 70s, coming of age in the 80s, trying to get jobs in the 90s in what were basically white male-dominated professions. Every black or brown person in the audience is nodding. Every woman's nodding because the outcome is the journey is different, but the outcome is exactly the same. So anyone of difference in the audience is nodding. And what upsets me greatly is there's a lot of people in their 20s and 30s nodding now, and I thought those days were gone.
Me too.
Up until George Floyd, I thought those days were gone. And it sort of opened my eyes to the fact that I was moaning about my upbringing and keeping quiet all of that time, but it was still just as bad. And I have a lot of mentees of that age who are really struggling and are struggling to be heard. And I thought that was, that is a very kind of, it's a little bit soul destroying when you realize that the world hasn't changed. You thought it was getting incrementally better, and now it feels slightly like I'm back in the 70s as a teenager again. And not speaking up is something you just have to live with. I mean, it's a really difficult thing because it's not like I didn't try and speak up during my career, but I picked my time and place because I knew what the consequences would be.
And indeed, when you did,
that's the irony. I mean, I'm sort of, and what worries me, and people have said this is just not true. You got to where you got to because of your capability. That's a very nice thing for you to say. I will never be 100% certain that that's the case, and that I wasn't the positive beneficiary of positive action post Stephen Lawrence and post, but certainly not post George Floyd.
That's the worry, isn't it, as well? As a woman at the Ford Motor Company, I didn't actually realise I was a bit of a token woman. I didn't realise that I was so much part of the system that I thought the barriers were gone. I thought, well, here I am, graduate trainee, and I am the only female, but I didn't imagine that I would still be having this conversation for me 40 years later. I know. Or realising, because I think you became attuned to the system at 5. I didn't become attuned to the system until I was well into my 30s, and I heard it from other women that there was something awry with the system.
It's difficult now because I have friends who've known me for 40 years who'd never heard me until George Floyd, and they saw what I'd written in the paper, and they hadn't realised any of this. I'd never said anything about it. And one of them said to me, why haven't you ever said anything about this? And I said, if I had talked about this as I was growing up, what do you think would have happened? And he looked at me and said, I guess we wouldn't be friends.
Wow.
And that was,
It's very candid.
yeah. And I worry that when people saw what had happened to me as an assistant commissioner, that people would not want to speak up anymore because they would see, well, he wouldn't have said this as a police constable because he'd still be a police constable now and not 9 ranks further on. But he said it as an assistant commissioner and it still didn't help it.
Because you did get a target on your back.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't really, it happened the year before George Floyd when The Guardian was interviewing me about counterterrorism. It was a very straight interview. And at the end of the interview, they said, would you hire somebody in policing who used the expressions pickaninny or, women wearing a burqa look like letterboxes? Would you hire a person who said things like that? And I said the only thing you can say as a chief officer, which is, of course I wouldn't. Now, The Independent took that story, and clearly they were expressions that were famously used by Boris. So The Independent took the story, and their editor wrote the headline, Basu wouldn't give Boris a job. And I've been told from that moment on, my card was probably marked by the special advisors around Boris Johnson. Boris knew who I was. He would have definitely known who I was in that job. When he eventually became Prime Minister, I was briefing him in that job. But I'd known him since I was a detective superintendent working for Paul Stevenson when he was London Mayor. So they all knew who I was, but of course it didn't fit the culture war the Tories started about equality. Basically the death of diversity, equality and inclusion in this country long before Trump got to it. That was all started.
Very cleverly, his jokey style about being the most woke police.
Yeah.
And you becoming the most woke.
Well, it was actually his great mentor in the right-wing press who described me as the super woke so-called head of counterterrorism. And super woke I am. There is a definition. There is a definition of woke in the Oxford English Dictionary that when Kathy challenged me on that point, Kathy Newman on Channel 4, I said, look, by that dictionary definition, I am super woke. Are you racially and socially alert to injustice in society? Yes, I am. That's it. The way woke has now been twisted into a sort of far left rhetoric by the far right. I'm nothing to do with any of that. Extremism, given that my job was to counter terrorism and therefore to try and stop extremism, you might imagine I'm not really in that space. But the fact that you could be called things like that as a way of sort of chipping away at diversity as an issue, I thought was incredibly clever. And the Tony Sewell report on diversity that Boris, after George Floyd, said, well, I don't think this country is racist, but let's have a report to study it, and then we'll see what the report says. That comes out over a year later when the argument's gone. It's a classic Whitehall fudge of taking the heat out of a very emotional conversation. You might think
have an inquiry.
Yeah, have an inquiry. And that might be the right thing to do if the streets are boiling, but the streets weren't boiling. There was hardly any violence in the protest. There was a little bit, most notably on Whitehall. It was horrible to watch. Some of my colleagues were involved in it. It was a terrible thing. But actually, overall, across the country, hundreds of thousands of people protested peacefully. So it wasn't a question of you have to calm the public down. It was a question of we don't want to deal with this issue. So we'll kick it into the long grass. They did it very effectively. And the report, when it came out, not the whole of the report, but very few people ever read the whole of a report. The foreword written by Tony, who is a very sort of high-end educator and, an impressive individual, but he'd written this incredibly tone-deaf foreword. I imagine I did read every word of the report, but I imagine very few people, which is why I can say some of the recommendations were very good. But some of the data was very poor and poorly explained, and he got criticised for that. But very few people have got past a line in the foreword which described effectively the slave trade as the Caribbean experience. Now, how Tony, as an Afro-Caribbean man, could have used that expression and thought that would be acceptable in that report to anybody who looked like him or looked like me, I thought was tone deaf. And I think
once you get these headlines, it's a bit like there's been a recent Lean In McKinsey report about women. And one of the headlines that got picked up was that there's an ambition gap. And of course, that's, for a woman, that's an absolutely dreadful thing to say, because it's not a lack of ambition that means that women now, the numbers are going backwards again. Women are not getting onto boards. But actually what it is they're looking at a system they don't think is going to change. So that's the big difference. When I started out in all of this, I really thought it was changeable. But actually now young women coming through are looking at, corporate boards and thinking, that's not going to
I mean, that's
change,
a terrible thing
which
to
is
hear.
awful.
And I think you're right. And I think it's a terrible thing to hear. There's also a lot of the people I mentor who are incredibly capable people completely lack confidence because their initial assumption is, I'm not going to be able to get there.
Yeah.
And sometimes that isn't about their race or their gender.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is just because they're like 70 or 80% of the population, they're suffering from imposter syndrome. And you'll know this as a coach. You're a professional coach, I'm an amateur. But in terms of coach and mentoring, is trying to raise people's confidence and aspiration to get them to the starting line so they can actually have the confidence to try is a really hard thing.
What happens with the confidence issue is that all too often I find when it comes to women's confidence, there's a lot of talk about women's confidence because they're confident women don't express themselves in the same way actually as a lot of confident men do, because socially they haven't been conditioned.
You mean they're not prats? I have a very poor experience and image of overconfident men. And I think, and I come from a profession where women who wanted to get on in that profession, and I'm sure this is the same in business, see role models who seem to be getting to the top by being assertive, aggressive bullies, a kind of very male-dominated behaviour in sport that I grew up in and in my profession in policing that I grew up in. And they think that that's the way to succeed. It just isn't.
I'm really interested in how your leadership style actually developed, yeah? And one of the things I noticed in the book is there are 3 very strong role models who are women in the book. So one of them, obviously your mum, you had great admiration for your mother. One, your
still
wife.
Do, Mum, if
you
you're
still
listening.
do. Your wife, Nina, another very strong leader herself, and Dame Cressida Dick. So just tell me a little bit. I mean, I know they may be completely different people, and it's hard to generalise from 3 different women. But is there anything about what you've learned from them that's informed your leadership style?
Yeah, definitely from those 3 senior female leaders. But I also worked for a company for a while before I became a police officer, where I'd come from corporate banking, where I started my career after university, full of alpha men, command and control, bullies, profit motivated, largely greed, quite a lot of small c corruption in the city around that time in the late 80s, early 90s. I could have predicted all the banking collapses. Went out, resigned to join the police, had to wait a long time to join the police, joined another company as a salesperson. And I had a number of fast-track bosses. They all came in as your regional manager to get 6 months experience while you're repping around the streets of London or wherever you were in the country. We had one particular leader who came in who was a senior female leader who went on to be, briefly, because the business went out of business, but she went on to be on the board of Wang, the computer company. And she was incredibly young. She must have been, I was only in my early 20s. She must have been in her early 30s maximum. Extraordinary leader, but so obviously different. Yeah. Now, she was the kind of leader that I would then experience from Cressida, when I met Cressida Dick when I was a young DCI running a murder squad. She was Commander Serious Crime. Her sort of leadership style, unbelievably different from anything I'd experienced in policing up until then.
In what way? Do you want to articulate a little bit?
Well, it sounds patronising. So I'm always really worried about saying this because
it's not necessarily gendered.
I studied economics in the 80s and studied business, and we were being taught in business practice that there was a new style of leadership which would get us, basically make companies more successful, and it was called the feminine style of leadership. So instead of the iconic, heroic individual, which was a very male military, like a general at the top of the hill planting a flag, command and control. Instead of that, a collaborative, collegiate, compassionate leader would be able to get more out of a team and would be able to drive the team forward. Now, when I heard that, when I was being taught that academically in the 80s, I thought, well, to me, that made perfect sense. I'd been part of male sports clubs since I was 5 years old. Absolutely. I had learnt the FIFO technique. But I had learned that basically it was Darwinian. It was like Lord of the Flies. It was survival of the fittest, which is fine. If you're brilliant or if you're very aggressive, you are going to get to the top in teams like that. If you're neither of those 2 things, you haven't got a chance. If you're good but not great, if you're competent but average.
But also a team, you can't have everyone being if you think football, you can't have everyone being the centre forward. There are different positions to play, so that requires different mentalities, isn't it? And you've got to motivate them all.
Well, that's something interesting about diversity of thought and capability and opinion on a team as well. But the point is, it is about a team. It's not about that centre forward being the person who drives. And you'll see a lot of great sports teams fall apart, even though they're full of brilliant individuals, because they can't perform as a team. Yeah. So the feminine style of leadership was, I can make everyone feel valued and get more out of a team. And I had witnessed that as a sports person growing up, thinking this isn't the way to behave. Do you remember the famous story, given you're Scottish, about one of the greatest football managers of all time, Alex Ferguson, the hairdryer treatment? And they used to say his leadership was unique because he knew who needed the hairdryer treatment and he knew who needed an arm around the shoulders. But I think even Alex would probably agree that he's a command and control leader. It's his way or the highway.
Very successful over many years.
Very, very successful. And, there has been no more successful football manager in the UK for 13 straight years. But it's interesting how it all fell apart when he left. Yeah. So what do you leave behind you if that is your leadership style? Unless you're there, the iconic leader who can do everything, it falls apart. And that wasn't what I wanted to be as a leader. I wanted to make sure that what happens when you're not there, when you're not sitting in the office, when you're not coming to work?
When I think about the Alex Ferguson thing, I think the ability to keep that command and control for so many years, when you think about the number of people he has to influence, it's quite a small number really, because it's a football team. Yeah. Whereas actually, if you take a chief executive that uses that hairdryer approach everywhere, I think it's much less likely to have results.
Oh, I agree.
But you did say that you had people coming in as leaders in the Met Police, and you said that you could see how command and control over a short period of time could really affect performance positively. The difficulty was the minute they left.
Yeah. And loads of people listen to me and go, I'm not doing that, your style of leadership. I'm going to get results by doing this, the old-fashioned way. There are lots of ways to deliver results. I get that. I am not saying that some of the bosses I work for who were proper command and control gurus, and proper bullies, but they got tremendous short-term results by driving performance.
But they drove it through
fear. They drove it through fear.
It doesn't work long term.
And also, there was some very obvious, I wrote a whole chapter in the book about this kind of methodology of putting people on the spot, normally in public, in front of their peers, and taking them to pieces. Now, people who are trying their hardest, even if they're not competent, that's sort of room 101 for bad leadership, isn't it? I mean, that's not what you do to people. And of course, what you're doing is the expression was, you have to shoot one chicken to scare the rest. And that's what they're doing. That is what they are intentionally doing to disrupt the system. As soon as those leaders leave the organization relaxes. And that's really dangerous because it's hard to build the organization back up. So really perversely, we were at our best under that leadership. We knew our jobs best and our performance was best, and the public who wouldn't have seen what was going on inside the organisation would have gone, well, they're really effective now. So they come across as heroic. Only the people in the organisation who were virtually broken by it. Some of my colleagues were broken by it. That's the awful thing. I had to watch people have nervous breakdowns and need medical attention because of this kind of leadership. So that says to me, I don't want to be that leader. If my performance was only 80% of those type of leaders, I'd be happier. As long as, we could maintain that consistently. And what you can't have is this peak and trough, which you get from leaders that just wield big sticks. It's not the right thing to do. And don't get me wrong, because the other thing that people who study leadership and do MBAs in it and that kind of stuff will know that there's anywhere between 12 and 14 different styles of leadership, of which command and control is one. My preferred type, servant leadership, is another. What I like is the people who can adapt. So I have had some of my friends will say, you're hardly beta, Bas, you kind of,
yes,
you
exactly.
do exhibit quite a lot of alpha traits. They all laugh when my wife said, well, he just doesn't consider himself alpha. And all the blokes in my team just fell about laughing. I said, well, that's not the way he behaves, because I learnt the FIFO game. In an MBA,
and as an 11-year-old, you bulked up.
Absolutely. And in an
MBA
sort of context, that's adaptive leadership. So when it counts, if you've got a life-threatening moment, like a riot or a crime in action, absolutely. Or you've got a discipline problem, or you've got an efficiency problem where you're going to have to fire lots and lots of people, at some point you're going to have the ability to take command and control.
And I think, Neil, if I could just
I
say,
think you can still do it compassionately, though. I don't think you have to
I
be
agree.
ruthless.
And I think what's happened is when I think about leadership thinking, and for the last, I've been involved in management development, for 35 years. And when I think about all the work I've done, coaching, the leadership courses, all the leaders I've coached, so much of the thrust of leadership thinking has been about adding to that more agentic style, agentic being that, not command and control, but being clear, being decisive, knowing what to do, taking charge.
Yeah.
So much of that is there already in the people that make it to the top, that actually a lot of leadership training is actually trying to balance it with more of the compassion and the empathy and the listening. Because I know certainly as someone who's naturally agentic, that when I started to lead teams and I thought I can be, not a bully, but I could definitely say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it, etc., etc. I quickly realised, you don't actually get the best out of people, because I wasn't asking them what they tried or what they did. And so I realised at quite a young age, God, it doesn't work. And of course I was trained as a coach, and I got this amazing insight into how pull behaviours, coupled with knowing when to take charge, is the right combination. But I think people, and this worries me, is because I think there's a correction again, because I think people think that after George Floyd died, I think there's a feeling that leadership theory, banging on about diversity and talking about empathy all the time, because there was such a big movement to that, is thinking, do you know what? We need to get back to business. That's not how it's done. And so I'm worried that there's an overcorrection.
You're definitely right about that. There is an overcorrection.
There's an overcorrection.
There's a backlash to the whole thing.
There's a whole backlash.
When I'm feeling less optimistic, I should never do this publicly, but the reality is, quite often I sit there and think, we lost. We lost the culture war. We lost the diversity war. We lost the argument. The moral argument went out the window, and we are back in a place where people are saying, no, we were much more effective when we just put all of that to one side. We've got whole political parties talking about that. So, yeah, absolutely, it's gone on. And that is, in my view, completely the wrong way.
I just want to talk about changing the system. Because we're both
I wish I had.
Yes, we're both in a slightly
we weren't feeling very optimistic when we last spoke about this.
We weren't feeling very optimistic. And so it's really interesting you talk about the moral argument didn't work, because I think when it comes to gender equity, I've used the business argument, the economic argument, and made the point to boards, to people, that it just makes sense to have a diversity on the team. And therefore, because when you just look at the statistics, you do find that organisations that have more women at the top are more successful. And you also find, even more so, if you've got diversity of ethnicity and race, it's even more pronounced that those companies that have that represented at the top actually do well. And the thing that kills me is that people come back and say, yes, but Geraldine, that's not necessarily causal, that relationship. And so the first time someone pointed that out, I didn't quite get it. And then I realised they were saying maybe they can afford to have women on the board because they're successful companies.
So they can take a hit in their performance by hiring all of those substandard people like you and me.
But it's the fact that people use that argument. I'm thinking,
I'm so pleased you didn't absolutely blow your stack, proving that maybe senior female leadership is better than male leadership.
Fortunately, I didn't quite get the
at the time
that it was it was presented to me in front of a number of people, and I just was taken back by the fact you'd use the statistical argument, which means you actually think that.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting when we had our pre-chat is that you've used the more, and I'm now thinking, do you know what? We just need to use the moral argument, which is basically the common sense argument. And the common sense argument, it just makes sense that leadership should be representative of what they're leading. It just makes sense. Yeah. Whereas you now are, you've turned your back on the moral argument. You said because you've tried the moral argument, you think it doesn't work.
I like to think I've never turned my back on a moral argument. Just if anyone's listening,
your back, that's way too strong.
I'm distressed and disillusioned by the moral argument, and it's funny when you say about it. It's just common sense. There's a very funny expression that says the trouble with common sense in policing is it's just not very common. And I wish that was the case, but for people who
yes.
for people who see difference as a threat or something to be afraid of, that threat or that fear of can turn to hatred. I've seen a lot of that professionally in my career, but inside organizations, it's I want the status quo because I understand the status quo, and I think the status quo is where we should be. And 30 years ago, McKinsey did a report about diversity in the boardroom and showing that, companies were experiencing much greater productivity and growth, efficiency, effectiveness by having diverse boardrooms. And that's because most people who run companies and most people who run policing ought to appreciate that it's an incredibly complex thing to do, full of incredibly wicked problems that are almost impossible for any single individual to solve. So because it's such a complex thing, the common sense bit for me is, well, surely more brains, more views,
Absolutely.
more thoughts, more difference, that's going to be a good thing. So the common sense bit would be that. It's not a moral argument. You're going to be better because you have different. Now, of course, if you're the kind of person who doesn't like difference, you're never going to accept that argument. You're going to say, we're better as we are. And the people making that decision, generally speaking, have been white men for as long as either you and I can remember. White, straight men. That's the world I grew up in. It's the world you grew up in.
Still, and to a large extent, the world we live in.
Massively. 91% of policing
30 years later.
Yeah, 91% of policing is white. 74% of it is male.
Oh, I wondered what the gender split was.
We don't know what the sexuality split is, but it's going to be largely straight. So you are battling uphill to get your voice heard and to get your difference heard. And I think the reason I don't like the moral case is, my view is, if you're an adult, if you can't treat human beings as human beings, that you have to treat them differently because of their protected characteristics, because you're scared of them, and you're an adult, it is too late for me to convince you. Why should I expend my energy on a sort of a moral cause that you should have been taught by your parents, your teachers, your peers? The fact that you have not understood that and you are now an adult.
Too difficult to unwind.
It's too much effort. So what I want is people who are willing to give people equality of opportunity, not equality, because that's nonsense. We're never all going to be equal in our capabilities, but an opportunity to show what I can do.
That's equity, isn't it?
Yeah, and once I get to that point, then it's up to me to show that I can shine. That would be great. That would be a start for me. Having to educate you that is a fair thing to do, when you describe it as common sense, it's common decency for me. Treating human beings as human beings is very difficult unless you're exposed to people of difference. I'm absolutely positive the people I grew up with, the ones that I love, and we're incredibly close now, who were, I would describe as casually racist when I met them because they were ignorant. Yeah. They've spent years being exposed to my father, me, my brothers, a completely different person with a different background to them. That long-term exposure has made them realize that actually not only are we not different, but we're much more similar than not, and that's the little bit about the reverse of the FIFO principle. Wouldn't you want to fit in with a culture that was wonderful that I've just described you? I have no problem fitting in, to a culture that's great. I really dislike having to fit in with a culture that's wrong. And, we've all had to grow up fitting in somewhat with a culture that I think is wrong.
And I think, when I think of what that does to you is you're not just playing a straight hand of cards. That's the way I think of it. You've actually got two. So when you're influencing as a woman, and it's a lot of men in the room, you aren't just saying what you feel, because actually you have had feedback that if you're too assertive, you're aggressive, and if you're not assertive enough and you're too consultative, you're not strong enough to be a leader.
Yeah.
And that's the double bind that women find themselves in.
People don't understand what prejudice is. So, or they understand what prejudice is. I don't think they really understand. I'll do it from racism because that's what I know most about, because that's my experience. But it's the same in terms of misogyny. It's the same in terms of a homophobia. It's a power construct. Mm-hmm. See, I think the real problem we have in society is bullying. Bullies get what they want, and they will find a weakness, what they would perceive as a weakness. And that weakness is usually difference, because effectively it's easier to isolate you from the people around you. The people who've been doing that for years, who've been very successful, have been white, straight men. We are talking about a system thing, and the people in power who are capable of exercising that power over you are white, straight men. Yeah. So there are plenty of bigots and prejudiced people and homophobes and misogynists who are black and brown.
Absolutely.
And female, yeah. So that's not what we're talking about here. No. We're talking about your ability to exercise power over another human being. And if you don't have the kind of qualities we'd like to see in people, which is you treat people with equity, you treat people for their their competence and their character and their capabilities, and not for their whatever their protected characteristic might be. Yeah. If you don't have that, you are going to go with what you know. I remember giving this sort of my life story, the little precursor to this book, as a public speech to a board of trustees of a police authority. And after I'd finished, I wanted to hear the next speaker. So I said, do you mind if I stay and listen to the next speaker? And they said, yes. So I went to sit at the back, and I sat on a table with some of the trustees. There's a woman sitting next to me in her mid-60s who was a very successful CEO of a company in the city of London, who was virtually in tears. I said, are you all right? And she said, well, I've never heard anything like that before, which was both flattering and really concerning. Wow. That you could be in your mid-60s, a successful CEO running a company. It was fantastic that she was moved by it and said, well, I will see the world differently. That's great. I don't meet many people like that. So it was wonderful to meet that person and for them to have had a bit of an epiphany. I usually meet people trying to give me the other argument. And the reason they're doing that is for the reason you said, is you've been privileged all your life. People hate this term, white privilege. But if I told you what brown privilege was like, effectively growing up, never being able to be served at a bar, never getting picked up by a taxi, getting stared at, getting abused in the street, being followed around shops by security guards. And by the way, some of that stuff happens to me today. And I used to run counterterrorism in this country, being stopped and searched. I mean, I run a book with a friend of mine who's a 6'3", very, very Belfast accent, red-headed Irishman, ex-PSNI. We run a book to PSNI? See Police Service of Northern Ireland. So we're both cops. I effectively look like I do. He looks like he does. And we used to run a book to see how many times we were stopped going through airports worldwide. And post 9/11, I overtook him by a country mile. So I understand what it feels like to be different and have no privilege and have those experiences. You don't understand what I'm talking about because it has never happened to you. Yes. It has never happened to you. A friend of mine described, she's married to a white guy who every time they go out to a restaurant or a pub, because of the part of the world they live in, he has to go in first and check that it's okay for his wife to enter that pub. When they go on holiday, he has to check whether or not it'll be okay for them to go as a mixed-race couple. It's 2026. And that kind of thing, listening to that is really difficult to listen to. And so I'd want to leave you with the kind of, the reason I went to the business case is because I've lost heart with people understanding that it's morally wrong to treat me differently because of the way I look. So I go for policing, which is a profession which serves 100% of the community, regardless of what they look like, who they are, who they worship, what their sexuality is. You have to understand that you can only do that by consent. There's only 145,000 police officers. There's 70 million people. If they don't want to consent to your policing, they are not going to consent. You need their help. You need their help when you want intelligence. You need their help when you want a witness. Do you want them to come to court? Do you want them to help the front line when they're, when they're in an aggressive, difficult situation and probably getting their heads kicked in? Would you like them to step in and help the police? Or do you want them to sit there and film it and post it online, probably with a caption slagging you off? Because that's what happens now. So if you want the trust and confidence of all of the public, they all have to believe that you are on their side. The black community doesn't feel like that. Large elements of the brown community don't feel like that. LGBTQ plus don't feel like that. Because of Sarah Everard and Wayne Couzens and the Metropolitan Police, women and girls are beginning to think they're not on my side.
Rape for years, and the prosecuted.
Rape and domestic abuse, two of the worst investigated crimes in history. Rape being the second most serious crime anyone could ever suffer after murder. Domestic abuse being the most underreported crime, and very, the fact is, if you don't win the confidence of those people, you're in trouble as a police service. I made my sort of name as a detective on a unit called Operation Trident now in London. basically a unit that was dealing with a crack explosion and gang warfare in London. So lots of black drug dealers killing other black drug dealers, with lots of collateral damage for the community. Very serious stuff, mostly using guns. We had to do something about that. And the black community came to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner at the time and said, you've got to do something about this. They're corrupting our youngsters. It's ruining our community. We don't feel safe. You've got to do something about it. We had to take it seriously, not ignoring it, because it was bad on bad. And, and it was the black community, and over-policed and under-protected is a way of describing that community. We decided to try and work together, and instead of policing you to police with you meant that we had to try and gain your confidence. For 10 years, from 1998 to 2008, we did that really effectively. And we started getting intelligence, we started getting evidence, we started getting witnesses coming to court, we started convicting these people who were ruining their community, and we got confidence from the black community because of it. That was the first time, and probably the last time in my career, that 10 years, when I thought we were really making a difference. Right. If you want to be successful as a police service, you have to win the confidence of communities who are going to help you. And you needed to have
black officers to do that.
Well, perversely, you didn't need them, but it really helps. Representation really helps.
And of course.
One of the things we were talking about, I've heard a couple of amazing people, John Amici, David Olusoga, Matthew Syed, all talking about diversity and whether it matters or not. And David Olusoga was, when he was a young boy, they were racistly bullied out of their house when he was a very young boy. And the police officers who came to treat him were white police officers, and he said they were brilliant. This is not an anti-police comment at all. And one of my audience, this is when I was running the strategic command calls, asked him, would it have made any difference to you if they were black? Because they were expecting him to say, no, of course not. It was just important. They were good at their job. And he went, it would have made the world of difference if they were black. I would have seen somebody like me helping me from my community. It would have made the world of difference to me. No one was expecting that answer except me, because I was one of only 4 ethnic minority people in the room. The other 3 ethnic minorities were going, yeah, of course it makes a difference.
Well,
representation counts.
Exactly. And, we talk about how you can't, if you don't see female role models, how do you know what it looks like to be a female
That brilliant expression from Michelle Obama. If you can't see it, you can't be it.
Yeah. So, last thing I want to talk about is you are, I think, a young man, and you've retired. And, I know 30 years in the police force, probably, certainly from the book, it doesn't sound like you slept at all. So 30 years could feel like 60 years in the police force. And the thing that, you're very clear that you've retired, you've done the book, you're doing the podcast, but something came through in the book, which was this real desire to be of service to the public, which I think maybe you got from your dad, yeah?
Well, mum and dad.
And mum and dad, because mum was nursing, wasn't she? Yeah. So what lies ahead? Is this going to rear its head again?
Yeah, I mean, I've always described myself as retired back in 2022, but I never stopped working. I sat on the boards of charities. I started my own company in 2023, so I sort of write, speak and advise on matters of policing, national security, diversity and leadership, and do some public speaking. I probably want to do less of the public speaking and more of the advisory work, but I've just been approached by people to start talking about how to train people in national security matters, part of which for me will be about ethics and diversity and equality. And to be able to get that into a curriculum for future civil servants and agency and law enforcement would be a huge thing. That's because it's a government commission. It's not very lucrative, but I do feel that I'm giving back. But when people say, I get the emotional blackmail all the time, when are you coming back? You're too young. You could give more, you could give more. And I think, read the book. I've given enough. When you say,
exhausting.
When a previous administration lengthened police service to 40 years minimum, I thought they were crazy. This is a job that prematurely ages people physically and mentally. And the charity I sat on when I first retired was Police Care UK, which deals with physically and mentally damaged police officers and their families. And over the last 5 years, the demand for their service has gone through the roof, which tells you something. And that's not just the job. That's the job plus cost of living, plus every other pressure that every other member of society is facing, plus being in this particular profession. So it's 3 years on. I've only just learned to enjoy what I would describe as retired from policing, but now with a much better work-life balance. I intend to continue that because I would like to live a long and happy life, not a short, fulfilled, but broken one.
And on that note, can I just say thank you very much, Neil? It's been
thank you to you.
Very enjoyable, and I know that both of us could have continued for some time, but thank you very much. And honestly, to be able to understand what Neil's talking about in terms of the life of a police officer, you really need to read the book and listen to Crime Agents.
If any police officer ever tells you they don't watch crime series, they're lying to you. It's the reason we're cops. So the best American series I've ever watched on crime is The Wire by a country mile. And when I was working on Operation Trident, if you watch The Wire, it's the closest in terms of what we did for a living, plus the politics that surround it. It's absolutely stunning. I don't know who the police advisors were on that program, but it's brilliant. Second one has to be my favorite detective when I was a child was Columbo. It's why I became a detective. So I know it won't make any sense to you. I'm just looking at how remarkably young you are. You know who I'm talking about, don't you?
Columbo
Peter
is.
Falk, Columbo. Look it up. Brilliant. So I did watch all of the American stuff, Starsky and Hutch, Hill Street Blues. I watched the Sweeney. But the other one from modern that people will understand is Line of Duty. It's brilliant. And I know Jed Mercurio, but more importantly, when people say, it's all, none of this stuff is realistic. Jed Mercurio's script advisor is one of my old colleagues called Dave Zinzat, who's a very experienced cop and a brilliant cop. So when you're watching that, and Dave and I used to work in anti-corruption together, so AC12 is based on CIB3, where Dave and I used to work many, many years ago, back in the early noughties. So a lot of of course there's a lot of melodrama in it, of course they've got the best kit, of course the interviews that they do with the suspects, with everything on screen and showing I wish we'd had access to that kind of technology, but mostly it's not far off the mark at all. So I think that is, of all the modern sort of crime series, that's brilliant.